hands! Don't move! It's my mother's funeral.
You think hiding in a church makes you untouchable?
I am a United States District Judge. You have no warrant.
We don't care who you say you are.
At 11:47 a.m. inside Grace Covenant Baptist Church, 4 ICE agents in tactical vests burst through the double doors and stormed down the center aisle during a funeral eulogy. The pastor stopped mid-sentence. Mourners turned in their pews. A woman in the third row pulled her grandchild close. The agents moved in formation, boots heavy on the worn hardwood, past the flower arrangements, past the framed photographs on easels, past 200 people dressed in black who had come to say goodbye to a 79-year-old woman named Estelle Drayton. They didn't stop until they reached the front pew, where a black man in a dark suit stood with one hand resting on the open casket. His mother's casket. The lead agent grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. "Federal agents, don't move!" The man didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "This is a funeral." It didn't matter. 2 agents forced his arms behind his back while a third drove him forward. His knees hit the floor first, then his chest, then the side of his face, pressed flat against the hardwood between the first and second pews. The sound echoed through the sanctuary. His 82-year-old aunt screamed from 3 rows back and collapsed into the arms of the woman beside her. His teenage niece stood frozen, mouth open, tears already falling. The pastor rushed forward. "Stop this! This is a house of God! Stop this right now!" No one stopped. The agents cuffed him on the floor of his mother's church, 6 feet from her body, while 200 mourners watched and a live stream camera recorded every second. The man on the ground was Federal Judge Nathaniel Drayton, a sitting judge on the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. The agents had no warrant, no probable cause, and no idea what they had just done. Nathaniel Drayton was 54 years old. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in southeast Washington, D.C., the youngest of 3 children. His mother, Estelle, worked as a seamstress 6 days a week. His father, Robert, carried mail for the Postal Service for 34 years and never missed a shift. Neither of them had attended college, but both of them made sure their children understood that education was not optional. Nathaniel was the first in his family to earn a degree. He graduated from Morehouse College, then Howard University School of Law, where he finished in the top 5 of his class. He clerked for a federal appeals court judge, spent 8 years as a public defender representing people who couldn't afford attorneys, then crossed to the other side and became an assistant United States attorney. At 43, he was nominated to the federal bench by the President of the United States. The Senate confirmed him with bipartisan support. For 11 years, Judge Drayton had served on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. He was known for 3 things: fairness, precision, and an unwavering reverence for constitutional protections. Attorneys who appeared before him, regardless of which side they represented, described him the same way: demanding but fair. He didn't tolerate laziness. He didn't tolerate theatrics. And he did not tolerate any agent of the government exercising power without legal authority. At the time of his mother's funeral, Judge Drayton was presiding over one of the most closely watched immigration cases in the country, a class action challenge to federal detention practices that had drawn national attention and put him directly at odds with the enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security. That detail would become critically important. The man who gave the order was Dominic Voss. He was 43 years old and had spent 16 years with Homeland Security investigations, climbing through the ranks not because of careful judgment or legal precision, but because he produced numbers. His supervisors called him a man who gets results. That phrase appeared in 3 separate performance reviews and was used each time to justify looking the other way. Over the course of his career, Voss had accumulated 7 excessive force complaints, 4 civil rights grievances filed by immigrant advocacy organizations, and 2 internal investigations that were opened with urgency and closed without explanation. None of it slowed his rise. None of it triggered reassignment. He learned the same lesson every year. Results mattered more than rights. His team that morning consisted of 3 agents: Kyle Rennick, 36, had worked under Voss for 4 years and never once questioned an order. He did what he was told, wrote what he was told to write, and kept his mouth shut. Sean Pollard, 31, was the youngest on the team. He had been with ICE for just under 3 years and was still early enough in his career to feel the weight of what they did. During the arrest at the church, his body language told a different story than the others. He hesitated at the door. He hung back in the aisle. He said nothing. Terrence Nolan, 39, had transferred from Border Patrol 2 years earlier, bringing with him his own history of complaints involving excessive force against detained migrants, none of which had followed him into his new file. The morning of the funeral, Voss briefed his team in the parking lot of a gas station 3 blocks from the church. He told them he had received a tip that a man connected to an immigration fugitive case would be present at a gathering at Grace Covenant Baptist. He didn't name the source. He didn't provide a photograph. He didn't confirm the identity of the individual. He didn't obtain a warrant. He saw a black man standing at the front of the church beside a casket and decided that was enough. The church had been live streaming the funeral for family members who couldn't travel. Estelle Drayton had touched many lives over 79 years, and more than 200 people were watching remotely, from living rooms, hospital beds, and military postings overseas when the agents came through the doors. The church's own security system added 2 more angles, one from the back of the sanctuary facing the altar, another from a side-mounted camera near the choir loft. At least 7 mourners inside the church pulled out their phones the moment the shouting started. Together, the footage captured everything. It captured Judge Drayton standing at the front pew with his right hand resting on the edge of his mother's casket, his lips moving quietly, saying something only she was meant to hear. It captured 4 agents in tactical vests, shoving past elderly women in the center aisle, one of whom stumbled into a pew and grabbed a stranger's arm to keep from falling. It captured the lead agent seizing Drayton by the shoulder, and the moment his face struck the hardwood floor. It captured his 82-year-old aunt, seated 3 rows back, clutching her chest and collapsing sideways into the arms of the woman beside her. It captured his teenage niece, standing rigid, hands trembling, screaming a sound the audio picked up with perfect clarity. It captured the agents rifling through Drayton's suit jacket pockets while he lay cuffed and motionless on the floor of his mother's funeral. And it captured 2 specific statements that would be replayed millions of times in the days that followed. The first came from Agent Rennick, who was recorded saying, "Stop resisting," while Drayton lay completely still, his cheek flat against the wood, his arms locked behind his back, not moving a single muscle. The second came from Voss himself. When Drayton said his name and told them he was a federal judge, Voss leaned down and the microphone on the nearest phone picked up every word. "We don't care who you say you are." Drayton lay on the floor with his cheek pressed against the hardwood and his wrists locked behind his back. His breathing was controlled. His voice, when he spoke, carried no panic, no anger, only the measured clarity of a man who had spent decades choosing his words with precision. "My name is Nathaniel Drayton. I am a United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. This is my mother's funeral. You have no warrant." Voss, still crouched over him with one hand on Drayton's back, laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable exhale, a real laugh, caught on 3 separate recordings from 3 separate angles. "Sure you are, buddy." The pastor, Reverend Isaiah Holloway, stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but his steps were deliberate. He reached into the pew where Drayton's overcoat was folded and pulled out a leather credential case. He opened it and held it in front of Voss's face. The camera from the choir loft captured the moment perfectly. Voss's eyes moved to the ID. The seal of the United States District Court, the photograph, the name. His expression shifted. Not remorse, not shame. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had just realized the size of what he'd done. Rennick leaned in and whispered something. Pollard took a full step backward, his face draining of color. For 90 seconds, no one in the sanctuary moved. The live stream kept running. The phones kept recording. Then Voss, without removing the handcuffs, stood and keyed his radio. The response from the field office was immediate. Even through the low-quality radio audio, the tone was unmistakable. It was panic. The cuffs came off. Voss did not apologize.
He straightened up, adjusted his vest, and said 5 words that would follow him for the rest of his life.
There's been a miscommunication. Drayton rose slowly from the floor. He brushed the dust from his suit jacket. He adjusted his tie. He turned and looked at his mother's casket. Then he said nothing. He stood in the center aisle of his mother's church, surrounded by 200 people holding their breath, and offered no words at all. His silence was more devastating than anything he could have said. The funeral could not be resumed. Reverend Holloway tried. He returned to the pulpit, gripped the edges with both hands, and opened his mouth to speak. No words came. He stood there for nearly 10 seconds before a deacon gently guided him to a chair. The sanctuary had become something other than a place of mourning. It had become a crime scene that no one had the authority to process. Estelle Drayton's casket had been bumped during the struggle. A spray of white lilies lay scattered across the floor, some of them crushed under boot prints. 2 of the flower arrangements near the altar had been knocked sideways. No one moved to pick them up. Drayton's Aunt Vivian, 82, was carried out through the side entrance by 2 relatives and a church usher. She was clutching her chest and struggling to breathe. An ambulance was called. She would spend the next 2 days in the cardiac unit at Riverside Memorial, diagnosed with stress-induced angina triggered by the shock of watching her nephew forced to the ground beside her sister's body. Drayton's niece, 16, sat in the second pew with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She had not stopped crying since the agents came through the doors. No one could reach her. Drayton's older sister Colleen stood near the side aisle and spoke through tears to a group of mourners that included 2 retired judges, 3 attorneys, a city council member, and the principal of the elementary school Estelle had volunteered at for 20 years. Our mother spent her whole life telling us the system would protect us. She believed that. She made us believe it. And they came into her church and put her son on the floor next to her casket. They desecrated her funeral. Drayton himself sat in the front pew. His suit was wrinkled where the cuffs had pulled the fabric. A small abrasion marked the left side of his face where it had struck the floor. He stared straight ahead at the casket. At his feet were the pages of the eulogy he had written. They had fallen from his jacket pocket during the arrest and been stepped on. He reached down slowly, picked them up one by one, folded them carefully, and placed them in his breast pocket. He never read them aloud. Estelle Drayton was buried later that afternoon in a private graveside service attended only by immediate family. There was no eulogy, there were no remarks. There was only silence and the sound of dirt hitting the lid of a casket that should have been honored inside the church where her son was put on the floor. Within 90 minutes, the footage was everywhere. The first clip to spread came from the church live stream itself. A family member watching from a military base in Germany had screen recorded the moment the agents entered the sanctuary and posted it with a single line. "They just arrested my uncle at my grandmother's funeral." The post was shared 4,000 times in the first 20 minutes. By the time the second and third clips surfaced, pulled from mourners' phones and uploaded with shaking hands and raw captions, the story had already crossed the threshold from incident to national crisis. The footage showed everything in sequence. A man in a dark suit standing beside his mother's open casket. Agents in tactical vests shoving through a church aisle. That same man face down on the hardwood floor, cuffed, motionless, while someone off camera screamed. When the detail emerged that the man on the ground was not just a grieving son, but a sitting United States District Judge, the outrage did not simply grow, it detonated. Legal communities across the country responded within hours. The Chief Judge of the Eastern District of Virginia released a rare public statement calling the arrest an unconscionable violation of judicial independence and basic human dignity. The National Bar Association issued a formal demand for an immediate federal investigation. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund called it one of the most disturbing abuses of federal power caught on camera in modern history. 3 separate congressional offices contacted the Department of Homeland Security before sundown, demanding a full briefing. By evening, cable news led every broadcast with the footage. The images played on loop. The casket. The floor. The cuffs. The flowers scattered across the hardwood. The headline wrote itself, and every network ran a version of the same words. ICE agents arrest black federal judge at mother's funeral without a warrant. By midnight, the footage had been viewed over 12 million times, and it was still climbing. That same evening, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Public Affairs Office released a 4-paragraph statement. It called the incident a case of mistaken identity that occurred during a lawful enforcement action. It stated that the agents involved were acting on credible intelligence and had followed established protocols consistent with agency guidelines. It expressed regret for any inconvenience caused and assured the public that a review was underway. Every material claim in the statement would later be proven false. The credible intelligence was a single anonymous phone call placed to the field office tip line. The caller was never identified. The call was never recorded. The content of the tip described a male of African American appearance, possibly connected to a fugitive immigration case. No name was given. No photograph was provided. No age, no height, no weight. The fugitive the agency later claimed the agents were pursuing was a 28-year-old man, 5'7", 150 pounds. Judge Drayton was 54, 6'2", and 210 pounds. The only physical characteristic they shared was the color of their skin. There was no warrant issued for the arrest. No probable cause had been established. No supervisor had signed off on the operation. Voss had briefed his team in a gas station parking lot and driven to a church where a funeral was in progress. The agency's statement did not mention that the location was a church. It did not mention that a funeral was taking place. It did not mention that the man who was detained was a federal judge. And when reporters followed up asking for the name of the individual, the basis for the intelligence, or the specific protocol that authorized entering a house of worship during a religious service, ICE declined to comment further. The silence told its own story. The federal response came fast and from multiple directions at once. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal investigation into the conduct of all 4 agents. The Inspector General's office launched a parallel review of the field office that had authorized the operation. FBI agents from the Civil Rights Division were assigned to examine whether the arrest constituted a criminal violation of Judge Drayton's constitutional rights under color of law. But it was the United States Marshals Service that responded with the most visible anger. Federal marshals are responsible for the protection of the federal judiciary. Their mandate is to ensure that judges can carry out their duties free from intimidation, interference, and threat. The arrest of a sitting judge without a warrant inside a church during his mother's funeral represented a direct violation of everything the Marshals Service existed to prevent. Their public statement was unusually blunt. The warrantless arrest of a United States district judge constitutes a direct threat to the independence and safety of the federal judiciary. The U.S. Marshals Service takes this matter with the utmost seriousness and is cooperating fully with all ongoing investigations. Congress moved within the same window. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee demanded a classified briefing from the Department of Homeland Security. 3 members of the House called publicly for the agents to face criminal charges. A 4th introduced a resolution condemning the arrest and calling for an independent review of ICE enforcement actions at houses of worship. Inside ICE headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from damage control to institutional survival. Internal emails, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed senior officials scrambling to manage what they already knew could not be managed. One email, sent from a deputy director to the agency's chief counsel at 9:47 p.m. on the night of the arrest, read, "This is the worst-case scenario. A sitting judge, at a funeral, on live stream. There is no good version of this story." No one replied to that email. There was nothing to say. Investigators from the FBI and the Inspector General's office interviewed all 4 agents separately over the following week. Each agent was questioned in a closed room without the others present and asked to provide a detailed account of the planning, execution, and justification for the arrest. Their stories fell apart almost immediately. On the most basic question, who gave the order to enter the church, the answers diverged. Voss said the decision was made collectively, based on the intelligence briefing. Rennick said Voss gave a direct verbal order in the vehicle. Nolan said Rennick confirmed the go-ahead. Pollard said no one explicitly said go, that Voss simply opened his door and the rest followed. On the question of whether they identified themselves as federal agents before making physical contact with Drayton, Voss claimed they did. Rennick said he believed Voss announced himself at the door. The footage from 4 separate recordings showed no announcement of any kind. On the question of resistance, Voss stated that Drayton had been non-compliant and physically aggressive, and had attempted to pull away. Every second of video evidence showed the exact opposite. Drayton had not moved. He had not raised his voice. He had not tensed his body. He had stood still, spoken calmly, and been taken to the floor without provocation. Rennick, asked whether he heard Drayton identify himself as a federal judge, said he had not. 3 separate audio recordings placed him 4 feet away at the moment Drayton said his full name and title. The microphones picked up Rennick's breathing. He was close enough to hear every word. Pollard broke first. Under sustained questioning on the second day, the youngest agent admitted that he had known something was wrong from the moment they pulled into the church parking lot and saw the hearse. He said Voss never showed them a warrant because there was no warrant. He said no one discussed probable cause. And he disclosed that during the drive to the church, Voss had made comments about these people, thinking they could hide behind churches, and that it was time to remind them the law doesn't stop at the door. Nolan's interview uncovered a separate problem entirely. Investigators discovered he had been involved in 2 prior warrantless arrests during his time with Border Patrol, neither of which had been reported or reviewed. Internal records pulled during the investigation showed that Voss's own complaint history, 7 excessive force grievances and 2 internal investigations, had been flagged for supervisory review on 3 occasions. Each time, the file was closed without action by the same field office director. That director was now under investigation himself. 1 week after his mother's funeral, Judge Nathaniel Drayton stood behind a podium on the steps of the federal courthouse where he had served for 11 years. He wore a dark suit, a pressed white shirt, and no expression that betrayed what the past 7 days had cost him. Behind him stood his sister Colleen, his niece, 2 attorneys, and a row of colleagues from the bench who had come not to speak, but to stand. The press conference was carried live on 4 cable networks and streamed by dozens of outlets. Drayton did not read from prepared remarks. He spoke from memory, the way he conducted proceedings in his courtroom, precise, unhurried, and without a single wasted word. He began with the facts. He stated the date, the time, the location. He named the church. He named his mother. He described the sequence of events the way a judge would enter findings into the record, each detail stripped of emotion and laid bare in clinical order. The agents entered during the eulogy. They did not identify themselves. They did not present a warrant. They made physical contact without verbal warning. He was placed face down on the floor and handcuffed beside his mother's open casket. Then he paused. He looked directly into the cameras and spoke about Estelle Drayton. He described a woman who worked as a seamstress 6 days a week and cleaned offices on the 7th. A woman who raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment and never once let them believe the world owed them anything. A woman who lived long enough to watch her youngest son sworn in as a federal judge and who died still believing that the law existed to protect everyone equally. They put me on the floor of my mother's church, he said, beside her body, in front of her friends and her grandchildren. They did not ask my name. They did not present a warrant. They saw a black man and decided he was guilty of something. That is not law enforcement. That is the precise injustice the Constitution was amended to prevent. He announced that he had retained counsel and was filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against the 4 agents individually, their supervising field office director, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, and the Department of Homeland Security. He took no questions. He stepped away from the podium and walked back into the courthouse. The doors closed behind him. The cameras kept rolling on the empty steps. What came next changed everything. During the discovery phase of Judge Drayton's federal civil rights lawsuit, his legal team issued subpoenas for the complete internal communications of the ICE field office that had directed the operation. What they found did not simply strengthen the case, it dismantled the entire narrative ICE had constructed and replaced it with something far darker than misconduct or incompetence. The agency had claimed mistaken identity. The evidence showed premeditation. Buried in the records was a series of text messages between Dominic Voss and a fellow agent at the field office sent over the 48 hours preceding the arrest. In one exchange from the evening before the funeral, Voss wrote 7 words that would become the centerpiece of the federal prosecution. "Gonna be at that church tomorrow. Let's see how tough he is off the bench." The recipient replied with a single emoji. Neither agent reported the exchange. Neither flagged it for supervisory review. The message made one thing undeniable. Voss knew who Nathaniel Drayton was. He knew Drayton was a federal judge. And he knew Drayton was presiding over the immigration detention case in which ICE was a named party. A case that had generated significant internal frustration within the agency after Drayton issued a series of rulings restricting the conditions under which detainees could be held. The anonymous tip that Voss had cited as the basis for the operation was traced during discovery to a prepaid phone linked to a registered ICE informant. When investigators contacted the informant, he confirmed he had been asked to make the call by someone inside the field office. He had no knowledge of any fugitive connected to the church. He had never heard the name Nathaniel Drayton. He was told to call the tip line and report a male of African American appearance at Grace Covenant Baptist Church on the day of the funeral. He was not told why. The implication was no longer a matter of interpretation. The arrest of Judge Drayton had not been a mistake. It had not been a case of bad intelligence or poor judgment. It had been a deliberate, coordinated act of retaliation against a sitting federal judge for rulings that ICE disagreed with. It constituted obstruction of justice, intimidation of a federal official, and a direct assault on the independence of the judiciary. And every piece of evidence had come from the agency's own records. The federal grand jury convened for 6 days. They reviewed the video evidence from the church, the body camera footage from the U.S. Marshals who responded to secure the courthouse after the incident, the text messages recovered during discovery, the phone records linking the anonymous tip to an ICE informant, and the testimony of 14 witnesses including Agent Sean Pollard, who had agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors. When the indictments were returned, they came down on all 4 agents and the field office director who had supervised them. Dominic Voss faced the heaviest charges: conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, making false statements to federal investigators, and retaliatory action against a federal official, a charge that carried particular weight because it meant prosecutors believed the arrest was not an accident, but a deliberate act designed to punish a judge for his rulings. Kyle Rennick and Terrence Nolan were each charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights and deprivation of rights under color of law. The evidence showed they had participated knowingly in an operation that had no warrant, no probable cause, and no lawful basis. Pollard, who had broken during his interview and provided the most damaging testimony against Voss, was offered a reduced plea agreement in exchange for his continued cooperation. He accepted. The field office director, Raymond Cahill, 56, who had overseen Voss for the past 4 years, was charged with conspiracy and failure to supervise. Investigators had documented 3 separate occasions on which complaints against Voss had been flagged for Cahill's review. Each time, the file was closed with no action, no interview, no disciplinary note. Cahill had signed off on each closure personally. At Voss's arraignment, the federal magistrate set bail at $500,000. The amount drew immediate attention. For a federal agent with no prior convictions, it was unusually high, a signal that the court viewed the charges as exceptionally serious. Voss's attorney objected on the record, calling the prosecution politically motivated and designed to make an example of a dedicated public servant. The magistrate looked at him for a long moment before responding. Your client arrested a sitting United States district judge at his mother's funeral without a warrant. The political motivation, if any, appears to have been on his side. Voss posted bail that evening. He did not speak to reporters. He was placed on indefinite, unpaid suspension by the agency the following morning. His credentials were confiscated. His service weapon was surrendered. For the first time in 16 years, Dominic Voss had no badge, no authority, and no one willing to look the other way. The trial began on a Monday morning in the same federal courthouse where Judge Drayton had presided for 11 years. A different judge had been assigned to the case, brought in from the Western District to avoid any conflict. The courtroom was full before the doors opened. Prosecutors began with the footage. The live stream recording played on 2 large monitors positioned so that every juror, every spectator, and every defendant in the room could see it clearly. The video ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds. It began with the church doors opening and ended with Voss saying, "There's been a miscommunication." 3 jurors visibly reacted during the first minute. One covered her mouth, another looked away and then forced herself to look back. A third stared straight at Voss, seated at the defense table, and did not look away for the rest of the playback. Over 4 weeks, prosecutors called 31 witnesses. Mourners described what they saw and heard inside the sanctuary. Fellow judges from the Eastern District testified about Judge Drayton's reputation, his judicial temperament, and the immigration case he had been presiding over. ICE whistleblowers, 2 analysts who had worked in the same field office, testified that Voss had openly expressed frustration with Drayton's rulings in the detention case, and had referred to the judge using language they described as racially charged. Digital forensics experts authenticated the text messages, confirmed the phone records, and traced the anonymous tip to the ICE informant's prepaid device, with certainty that left no room for dispute. Voss took the stand in his own defense during the 3rd week. His attorney guided him through a version of events in which every action was justified, every decision was procedural, and every outcome was an unfortunate misunderstanding. He used the phrase "following protocol" 4 times in his opening answers. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him to name the specific protocol that authorized entering a house of worship during a funeral service without a warrant. Voss could not name it. The prosecutor asked him to produce the warrant. There was no warrant. The prosecutor asked him to explain the text message sent the night before the arrest. Voss said he did not recall the context. The prosecutor displayed the message on the courtroom monitor and read it aloud. "Gonna be at that church tomorrow. Let's see how tough he is off the bench." Voss stared at the screen and said nothing. The prosecutor then asked him to explain how the fugitive he claimed to be pursuing was 28 years old, 5'7", and 150 pounds, while the man he arrested was 54, 6'2", and 210 pounds. Voss said the description he received was vague. The prosecutor replied, "The only thing vague about your description was everything except the race." The jury was sent to deliberate on a Thursday afternoon. They returned Friday morning. Guilty on all counts for Dominic Voss. Guilty on all counts for Kyle Rennick. Guilty on all counts for Terrence Nolan. Guilty on the conspiracy charge for Raymond Cahill. Sentencing followed 6 weeks later. Voss received 7 years in federal prison. Rennick received 4 years. Nolan received 3 years and 6 months. Cahill received 2 years. All 4 had their law enforcement certifications permanently revoked. None would ever carry a badge again. The civil lawsuit settled before trial. The Department of Homeland Security, facing the same video evidence that had convicted its agents, the same text messages, the same phone records, and the same testimony from its own informant, chose not to take the case before a jury. The settlement was $4.6 million, one of the largest individual civil rights settlements ever reached against a federal law enforcement agency. The money alone would have made headlines, but the terms that accompanied it carried more weight than the dollar figure. The agreement included sweeping mandatory reforms imposed on the field office and extending to agency-wide policy review. Independent civilian oversight of all ICE enforcement actions involving houses of worship, with quarterly audits and public reporting. Mandatory warrant verification procedures requiring supervisory sign-off and documented probable cause before any arrest operation could be initiated. A zero-tolerance policy for retaliatory actions against judicial officials, with automatic referral to the Inspector General for any complaint involving a member of the federal judiciary. The creation of a civilian review board with investigative authority over complaints filed against the field office, staffed by attorneys and civil rights professionals appointed independently of the agency. And a requirement that all prior complaints against agents involved in use of force incidents be reviewed and documented before those agents could be cleared for field operations. Judge Drayton donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish the Estelle Drayton Justice Fund. The fund provided legal representation to immigrants and citizens whose civil rights were violated by federal agents, specifically targeting cases where victims lack the resources or visibility to fight back on their own. The fund was administered by a board that included civil rights attorneys, community advocates, and 2 retired federal judges. Within its first year, it had taken on 40 cases. Drayton returned to the bench 3 months after the settlement was finalized. His first day back, the courtroom was full before the bailiff opened the doors. Attorneys, clerks, fellow judges, journalists, and members of the public filled every seat and lined the back wall. When Drayton entered in his robes, the room went still. He sat down, arranged his papers, and looked out across the courtroom. He did not reference the case. He did not reference the arrest. He paused for a moment and then spoke. "The law failed me on the worst day of my life, but I am still here, and so is the law. My mother believed that. I still believe that." He picked up his gavel. The courtroom was silent. Then he began. Back at Grace Covenant Baptist Church, a small bronze plaque was installed on the wall beside the front pew. It was paid for by the congregation and unveiled during a Sunday service attended by over 300 people. The plaque read, "In memory of Estelle Drayton, who believed the law belonged to everyone." No other names were listed. None needed to be. This case was intense, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.